If we haven't met before, like Bradley said, I've been here about 6 weeks now. My name is Jeff, the associate pastor here now at Open Door. We're going to go on a bit of a journey this morning. So if you got a Bible with you, you can open up right to the start. Genesis 1, Genesis 2. We're not going to read through it, but you can certainly try to follow along and find out where I'm right and where I'm wrong. And then decide which I'm more of. The cool part is that our kids are actually going through the same story. They've spent the whole month going through this book of Genesis, especially, not the book of Genesis, the creation story. So Genesis 1, Genesis 2. And they keep asking, when are we going to talk about Genesis 3? And I say, we'll save that for some other time. But so that they're going through the exact same story as us right now. So that's where we're going to start. And then we're going to sneak our way into this obscure Greek word that the early church used to talk about God. So we'll figure out what that word is. Then we're going to head to talk about something called atomization. I'm going to explain what that word means and how our societies become atomized. And then it's a talk about creation, so we need to throw in some Darwin just for fun. So we're going to end with Darwin and then go to like the now what section. Okay, so we're going to start with the so what. We're going to end with the now what. So that's the journey that we're going to be on for the next little bit. So if you've got Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 open, here's where we'll start. So Genesis 1, Genesis 2 is the creation story, right? It's this part of the Bible that it used to be in our culture anyway, that you would say, the creation story, Adam and Eve, and everyone would pretty much know what you were talking about, right? You'd say like the tree or the serpent, and most people would figure out what you were on about. Not so much anymore. The church just likes to debate about the story instead, but that's where we're going to start. So if you read through while we go through this, you're going to notice a bit of a pattern. Maybe you've heard the pattern before. So this is the pattern. God creates something, and then God says that something is good. Right? So God creates something. God said that something is good. God creates something. God says it's good. Okay, that's the pattern. And that pattern keeps going and going until the middle of day 6, when mankind is created. And that pattern is broken a little bit. God adds a little bit of more information in there. And it's like God is saying in that point that it's not just the creation of mankind that's what creation is all about. It's God saying, okay, now I want you to be fruitful, to be multiplying, and I want you to go and take care of this thing. Some people call it that it's the co-creation, that God now wants us to be co-creating alongside God. And that's like a whole sermon series. We're not going to touch on that, but it kind of lets us know, it gives us a hint that even when Adam and Eve are created in the story, that there's still something not quite perfect, not quite right, until God adds a bit more to the story. It says, you guys be co-creators with me, and then God calls that very good. In Genesis 2, then, there's still something else missing. God creates Adam, but Adam's lonely, right? So God figures, there's this different theme in Genesis 2, is that Adam needs something like companionship. So God creates Adam, but Adam is lonely. Now, if you think about that, for half a second, you'd think, well, it was just Adam and God. Just Adam and God. You'd think that would be enough companionship, right? If you were just hanging out with God, if you had God, you had some one-on-one time with God, or one-on-three time. One-on-one time with God, right? You think that's enough companionship. That should be all that you need. And yet, God recognized Adam isn't fulfilled here. He's lonely here. He needs companionship here. So God brings all the animals to Adam, and Adam helps God to name them. And God says there still isn't a suitable helper here. So that's when the pinnacle of creation happens. And I'm not about to say that women were the pinnacle of creation, because the Bible doesn't support that. The Bible doesn't support that men are the pinnacle of creation. What God creates, when God goes and takes a rib, as the story goes, takes a rib out of Adam, creates Eve, what's created is relationship. What's created is community. And so the pinnacle of creation, some scholars and ancient Hebrews are saying, the pinnacle of creation isn't just humanity, but it's community. So that's what we're going to dig into a bit this morning, is this notion of community. Because when it boils down to it, God created not just two people, but God created a community. But let's back up a bit, because maybe that's a weird idea, maybe that's a weird thought, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, and that's fine. But the early church, when they got together, the early church was trying to figure out what are the requirements for you to be like a Christian? If we were to write them down, what would that look like? What ticky boxes would you have to tick off? That, yeah, I believe that. And one of the most difficult things that they found was, how do we describe the indescribable? How do we describe this weird concept, this crazy idea that we call God? And they came up with this notion of the Trinity, right? The 3 in 1, that God is 3 persons and yet God is 1. But then nobody there spoke English. They all spoke Greek, right? So they came up with this word instead. This word is perichoresis. It's a Greek word. It's a compound word, perichoresis. I totally forgot a quote, so let's go back to my quote here. A guy named Michael McIntyre. If the idea about community being the pinnacle of creation is a weird one to you, let's read through this quote together. So he's a practical theologian from the States. He says, from the one, from Adam, God creates 2. Human becomes humanity, and at the pinnacle of creation stands God's crowning achievement, community. In God's infinite wisdom, God chose to purposefully design humanity to be in relationship with God and with one another. And God calls this very good. So that's the quote about community and God, the pinnacle of creation being community. Back to this word about perichoresis. So it's a compound word, okay? So if you remember back to your English school days, remember a compound word is 2 words like smashed together. So an example would be like extraordinary. So something is extraordinary, it's 2 words smashed together. It's not just ordinary, it's beyond ordinary, it's extraordinary. Or something is all together, right? So it's everything, all things together. Or it's a selfie stick, right? It's 2 things combined together that don't belong. Anyway, so compound words are 2 words put together. So perichoresis breaks down into 2 parts. There's peri, which is where we get the word periscope. So a scope looks, and peri means it looks around, right? So peri means around. And choria is the second part of the word, and it boils down to the idea of to make room for, or to go forward, or to contain, or to dance. It's where we get the word choreography. So perichoresis is these 2 words put together. Peri meaning around, choria meaning dance. So one of the ways that these early Christians began talking about God is that God is a divine dance. This guy named Timothy Keller wrote this about perichoresis. And it's a bit long, so you can check out for the first bit, and then I'll throw the last bit up on the screen there, because it's really, he says some amazing things about this word. So the life of the Trinity is characterized not by self-centeredness, but by mutually self-giving love. When we delight and serve someone else, we enter into a dynamic orbit around him or her. We center on the interests and desires of the other. That creates a dance, particularly if there are 3 persons, each of whom moves around the other 2, and so it is, the Bible tells us. Each of the divine persons centers upon the others. None demands that the others revolve around him. Each voluntarily circles the other 2, pouring out love, delight, and adoration into them. And this is the part to follow along on. Each person of the Trinity loves, adores, defers to, and rejoices in the others. So each person of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, loves, adores, defers to, rejoices in the others. And that creates a dynamic, pulsating dance of joy and love. And the early leaders of the Greek church had a word for this, perichoresis. Have you ever thought of God as a dynamic, pulsating dance of joy and love? Sometimes we think of God as this old guy in the sky with a white beard, maybe a cane, some lightning throwing down. You ever thought of God as a dynamic, pulsating dance of joy and love? That's a God that we can spread around. That's a God that we can share. That's a God we can fall in love with. A dynamic, pulsating dance of joy and love. So we were created for community. Adam and Eve were created for community. The pinnacle of creation was community. And perichoresis, this idea of a divine dance, says we weren't just created for community, we were actually, as people, created by a community. God itself is a community of three. We were created for community and by community. But that's where this idea of atomism or social atomization comes in. And it's probably a term you've never heard. I hadn't until like a year ago when someone way smarter than me introduced me to the concept. I want you to think of it like this. We're going to go through a bit of a word picture in this. So imagine that the old part of the building, right? Like the gym, the school, that part of the building. For some reason, it needs to be torn down. It needs to be torn down. And we decide, you know what? We could probably save a few bucks if we did it ourselves. So we get a team together. Zach's on it. Andy's on it. A few other people are on this team, right? And we figure, okay, when we tear that part of the building down, let's make piles of stuff. So we're going to make a pile over here of like copper pipes. And we're going to make a pile over here of all the drywall that we've collected. And maybe over there is a pile of all the different types of flooring. And just piles everywhere associated by what things are, right? So we got our copper, we got our drywall, we got our flooring, we got whatever else. And so for the first while we're tearing down the building, we use this pile idea. Okay, so we got everything sorted into its piles. But then the end of the day comes, and it's getting dark, and we're tired, and we're sick of this pile thing. It's a stupid idea, we discover. And it's an idea that makes no sense anyway, but we'll go with it. We figure this pile idea is ridiculous. We're going to stop it. So we just start chucking stuff around, right? We're tearing stuff down, and it's ending up on the road. It's going in the neighbor's backyard, and it's ending up in the garden. It's just getting chucked wherever we see fit because we're done with this pile thing. Our society, the society that we're a part of, that we get to create, we used to be a lot more like those piles. So maybe we were a piece of copper pipe. Zach, you were a piece of copper pipe. And maybe you were bent a little bit different, or you were a little different shade of copper, or something. We were a little different each piece of copper, but we knew that we were safe. We were understood because we were around people that thought kind of the same as us. So we were all together feeling understood and safe as a pile of copper. Or maybe you were a piece of flooring, and you were different. You were a piece of carpet, but you still got along with like the laminate or the linoleum, even though they're a little bit weird, because you could share stories together about that time that you got walked on and some kid puked on you during movie night. And you could share stories like that, right? So even if you were different types of flooring, you could still share stories, still have a common interest. Our society used to be a lot more like that. Whereas now our society is a lot more where things are just thrown all over the place. So maybe you, like me a lot of the time, feel less like a pile of stuff that's surrounded by people that are like-minded or that you can feel safe with, or that you feel connected with. And we're more like people who've just been thrown around. We don't know where we quite fit in. We don't know which pile we belong to. We don't know where our community, where our group is. And that is called atomization, where we're separate, we're apart. We are disconnected from each other. It has nothing to do with atom from the creation story. It's like atom with a T, so like atomic particles. But that is what our society, the society that we are part of, that we get to create, that we call our community. That's what it's like right now. And it seems like the bigger that a culture, bigger that a society gets, the more this becomes a reality. This guy named William Kornhauser, which is just an awesome name to say, William Kornhauser, he said this: mass society is an atomized society and an alienated population. So the bigger a society gets, the more people feel alienated and isolated. Even in Maple Ridge, where it's a bit of a more tight-knit community, we still feel this, right? And some people will say, well, all I have to do is reach in my pocket and I'm more connected than ever. That's true, but we still feel more disconnected than ever. Google's a really good friend to have because I was able to find out Time Magazine wrote this article last year saying that loneliness is the next major health epidemic in the West. Loneliness. They put it on par with obesity and with substance abuse. That loneliness is the next biggest health crisis. And a study done by Brigham Young University in the States found that social isolation or lack of social connection, so loneliness, increased people's mortality risk by 26 to 29%. So just the feeling of loneliness increased your risk of dying early 26 to 29%. And then a study done in the UK found that 48% of people felt like they were getting lonelier in general. So half of people in the UK, probably the same in Canada, I would assume, around the same, half of the people in the UK said, yeah, I feel lonelier now than I did before. And I expect that I'm going to feel lonelier tomorrow than I do today. That's just the trend that they're on. Even for pastors, those whose jobs revolve around being with people and being in community and creating community, 10% of them say that they increased this feeling of social isolation over the past 3 years. So as a society, we're feeling more and more like just stuff chucked all over the place, disconnected, and less like those piles of like-minded copper or drywall or flooring or whatever else. But we were created, remember, for community. And we were created, remember, by a community. So this idea of being atomized, this idea of being separate and apart and disconnected, that's why it hurts so much. That's why it cuts us so deep and increases our mortality risk. Because we were made for something different. We were made by community. Maybe you've heard of this guy before. His name was Charles Darwin. Anyone ever heard of Darwin? His beard game was pretty strong. He was a big deal in the 1800s. He wrote a book. His first book in 1859 was called On the Origin of Species. And in that book is where he introduced the idea, the theory of evolution by natural selection. The theory of evolution by natural selection. Later on in Darwin's life, he tweaked it a little. He adapted it. His idea evolved. Thank you. His idea evolved into something different, okay? So he started out by saying in general, now he didn't coin this phrase, but he essentially said it's the survival of the fittest was how his theory started. What it morphed into was something more along the lines of survival of the cooperative, is what he said. So those species who are able to learn to work together, especially human tribes and human cultures that learn to be collaborative, those are the ones that thrived. Those are the ones that survived. So it's not about the survival of the fittest, Darwin said. It's the survival of the cooperative. And this makes sense, right? Because you look at us, and we're not that scary compared to like a polar bear, but we're smart, and we know how to work together. So that's what makes us survive and thrive as a species. The term survival of the fittest was actually hijacked by a guy named Herman Spencer. He was a racist dude, so he wanted a way to say, well, my class of people and my race of people is better than anyone else. So he invented this term survival of the fittest. So actually nothing to do with Darwin's theory at all. He was just not a nice guy. There's this new reflection on Darwin's findings called the survival of the kindest. Survival of the kindest. I won't read you a quote from Darwin because it's kind of old English, but he essentially says that the most sympathetic groups of people are those that have the most kids. And then those kids become sympathetic, compassionate kids who then go on to have more kids of their own. So that he even saw in the study, scientific study of it, that there's a reason, you're more compassionate so you protect your kids and you protect your friends' kids more And then those kids survive and thrive. And then they have kids and it grows the species. So evolution is a more cooperative process than a competitive one. So if we think back to the creation story, back to the book of Genesis, the one that our kids are going through, and we put it beside a bit of Darwin's work, we see this, that no matter what, we were made to thrive through and for and by each other. That we were made to thrive through and for and by each other. Our society, our culture, our institutions, our world is better when we work together. It's the exact opposite idea of atomization, where we're apart and separate and disconnected. We do better when we are in community. So I threw a bunch of quotes. I threw a lot of info at you. Let's just back up the bus. So we started with the creation story, right? We started with Genesis 1, Genesis 2. We were created for community. We moved on to talking about this weird Greek word, perichoresis, God being the divine dance. We weren't just created for community, we were created by the God who is a community. We talked about Darwin, who says not only were we created for and by community, but we thrive better when we are a community. So here's the question. This isn't rhetorical, because we've got a bit of time. What about this place? What about Open Door Church? You could be here the first time, you could be here the 1,000th time, you could be here 6 weeks like me, or somewhere in between. What about this place, Open Door Church, we need to lean into to discover that need for community? So what do we do as a community to either build or strengthen or fulfill this community calling? So what do you think? Acceptance? So loving each other, caring for each other no matter what. Cool. Anyone else? What do you want to add to that? Yeah. Put differences, perspectives aside. We're all one. Doesn't matter if you're a bendy shape of copper or a straight one or a slightly greening one. Copper goes green, right? Yeah. We're all included. We're all together. Anything else? What makes us a great community at Open Door? Or what are we not good at for community that we need to get better at? Such as? So each individual's strength contributing to the community's strength. Okay? One or two more? Togetherness. What do you mean by that one? I like it. So, gathering together, having movie nights, having a lady needs a couch moved or something. Your friend, right? Yeah. Okay? One more. The ability to work through conflict in a loving, respectful way. So there's like a theme here of forget your differences, be accepting, be loving, be together, deal with conflict in a loving way. So just be a community that cares about each other. I like it. I like it. And it's what we've felt as we've joined here for the last 6 weeks, is that this is the stuff lived out at Open Door. So we feel it. We feel it. I said before that we're going to take a bit of information and then we're going to do something about it. That we're going to do the so what, and now we're going to do the now what. So that's where we're going to move on to. Some people will call it like a call to action. Here's your call to action, okay? Here's something for you to do. Before you leave here today, and this is serious, before you leave here today, find somebody, you could know them a little bit or maybe not at all, or find a group of people that you know, or maybe not at all, or maybe you know mutually other people. Find somebody or a group of people that you can make plans to have over to your house, or even better, go over to their house for lunch or for dinner. Okay, and I'm not just talking about, we should do that sometime. That would be fun. I mean, like, you got legit plans. You know their dietary restrictions. You know who's bringing the buns. You know who's taking care of dessert. You know what time their kids need to leave to get home for bed. Like, you got it set. You think we can do that? Find somebody or a group of people that you can actually have a meal together with. I know that we're good at community, but we get to know each other so much better when our mouths are full of food and our bellies are content, and we know each other's food allergies. My wife has a ton of food allergies, so don't invite us over, but we'll have you over. Now, some of you are like, but Jeff, I am an introvert. I can't do this. Let me tell you about my Sundays. I am an introvert. On a Sunday, whether I'm up front, whether I'm in with the kids, whether I'm at the back just pressing the button, I go home and I nap because I'm an introvert and this tires me out. Okay? Being around people, being around noise and stimulation, doesn't matter. It tires me out whether it's up here or back there, whether it's at a concert or anywhere. I understand the hatred of small talk. I get that social anxiety is a thing, but we were created for and by community. So this is just something we got to do as introverts. Or maybe you're like a super extrovert, and guess what? You need to get deeper than just the surface level chit-chat that extroverts are awesome at. You need to stretch yourself to dig in to find out what makes this other person tick. So it's a bit of a challenge for anyone, except for ambiverts. They do everything well. But, whether you're an introvert, whether you're an extrovert, this is a real thing that you can and should do because we were created for community, by community, and we thrive when we're in community. And a place like this is the best chance that we have to actually do it. A place like this is the best shot we've got at actually creating community. And then taking this community and making even a broader community so that we can start to be less atomized and more together, more connected, more thriving as a community around us. I'll wrap up with one last quote. It's by a guy named Bruce Ware, and I'll read it a couple times because it's good. The very fact that God, though singular in nature, is plural and societal in person. So the fact that God is one but many, the fact that God is one but community, indicates that we should not view ourselves as isolated individuals who happen to live in close proximity, but as interconnected, interdependent, relational persons in community. So he's saying this, the fact that God is a community amongst God's self is our example to say we can't just live this atomized way where we're all disconnected. It's our example to say we need to live interconnected and interdependent and as a part of a community. So may you find peace in knowing that you are part of a community here at Open Door Church and part of a greater community around us. May you find hope in a world that we have kind of co-created that tries to rip us apart and keep us disconnected. But may you remember that you were created for and by community and that you thrive best in community.